Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents To Serve the People. My Life Organizing with Cesar Chavez and the Poor, by LeRoy Chatfield, with Jorge Mariscal. Narrated by Paul Heitsch. Preface. Welcome. I call my writings easy essays, a title I borrowed from Peter Morin, who was a French Christian brother and who, with Dorothy Day, founded the Catholic worker movement in 1933, the year I was born. Peter Morin passed away in 1949 at age 72, and Dorothy Day in 1980 at age 83, exactly my age as I write this preface. Morin wrote his easy essays in verse, always about social justice, and published them in the Catholic Worker newspaper. I was a long-time faithful subscriber to the newspaper and read it cover to cover. Anti-war actions, conscientious objectors, social justice, civil rights, labor rights, feeding the hungry, houses of hospitality for the poor, back to the farm movement. The topics went on and on. I soaked it up. The cost of the newspaper was 1 cent per issue, and still is. Of course, those who admired the Catholic workers' commitment to voluntary poverty and service to the poor supported their work financially. My easy essays, now numbering well over 200, are not erudite literary material, uniquely profound, or the product of academic training. I wrote them without any expectation that a handful of them would be published in book form. I have Professor Jorge Mariscal to thank for that honor. The essays that follow are written using everyday words in simple sentences to tell a brief story, recount a childhood memory, or explain social issues I have thought a lot about or discussed with people with whom I have worked and admired. More often than not, the subject matter of my writing is the shameful absence of social justice I have personally witnessed at various times in my life and my response to it. Of course, essays of this nature will reveal more about me than I wish, but since nothing can be done about it except to not write them, this discomfort falls into the painful category of unintended consequences. If any of these essays prompt or provoke you to think about the importance of social justice in our society and its absence in your own life experience, so much the better. Very nice to make your acquaintance. LeRoy Chatfield. Cesar Chavez Day, March 31, 2019. Organization is sacrificing. Successful organized effort always means that the people who do the most work and have the most initiative often get the least credit, and at critical times are asked and required to submerge their individuality and yield their judgment to the desire of others. W.E.B. Du Bois. Let me say first that whether a person is born an organizer or learns to become one, you never recover from it. LeRoy Chatfield. Introduction. Jorge Mariscal. The lived experiences represented in these collected essays are complex. If they were to be reduced to a few basic ideas, the quotations just mentioned would serve us well. The pilgrimage of LeRoy Chatfield has been a long road that weaves its way through multiple collective projects designed to better the condition of the least of these. The intention of this book is to mine the stories that brings this pilgrimage to life in order to illuminate lessons that can be used by the dedicated organizers of the present and future, those organizers who may get the least credit and who will never recover from the disappointments and joys of their commitment to justice. The through line across Chatfield's journey is an unwavering focus on organizing communities so as to expand their agency, what Ella Baker called creating vehicles of power. Once that agency is directed against the structures of inequality, windows of opportunity for change begin to swing open. Because of Chatfield's personal formation, The commitment to organize for change consistently required that movement participants who chose to walk the organizer's path, especially those in positions of leadership, do their best to maintain their discipline, their integrity, their humility, and their humanity. First and foremost, it is our hope that activists of the present and the future can incorporate into their own work some of the lessons laced throughout the 36 essays that make up this book. Once adapted to the new context, these antecedents may be helpful for furthering the goal of social justice for workers, students, the poor, and others. Lessons found here may serve as warning signs alerting us to the tensions and miscalculations that emerge in every social movement. Chatfield reminds us, a movement is a series of trade-offs. If the results are negative, life goes on, and one has to make the best of it under the new circumstances. In other words, the word failure is irrelevant with regard to social movements because in every defeat are sown the seeds of actions to come within different conditions of possibility. As legendary activist Elizabeth Betita Martinez once put it, it's a long struggle for social justice, but there are traditions that get set. There are concepts that get established. There are visions that get put out. There are dreams that get dreamed, and just having those in our lives and our minds is a victory in itself. For those of you making the commitment to explore this book, please be advised that you will not find a standard biography, an organizational history, or even a strict linear chronological narrative. Rather, in a dialectical ebb and flow across time, you will observe one individual's commitment to progressive change and social equity from the second half of the 20th century to the present. It is a unique story with regard to the specific details of one man's life, but it is not unique insofar as it resonates with the lived experience of so many activists who chose to remain behind the scenes, anonymous insofar as they refused to claim personal credit for what the collective had achieved. From the vantage point of today's celebrity culture, such quiet dedication and sacrifice may strike some as quaint or even foolish. But today, in the chaos of our media-saturated celebrity cacophony, there are organizers quietly going about their business to bring forth a more equitable and just society. The essays that follow are woven through the dense fabric of post-war America and post-war California in particular. They contain contemporary observations juxtaposed with retrospective reflections as the narrator looks back and attempts to understand the meaning of each movement in order to interpret its lessons for the present. Chatfield's vision surveys past events as part of a continuum that constitutes what some have called the good fight, that is, the calling to devote one's life to the pursuit of equality for all. The social issues that concern him have not been resolved. The struggles represented here have not ended, and in fact will likely never end. If the arc of history does indeed bend toward justice, it is only because committed activists over time are pulling it in that direction. Within each piece, the protagonist's voice is center stage. At times, it may be accompanied by two supplementary sources. One, the recollections of other actors who participated in the same events, and two, short intrusions by the editor designed to provide additional background. In the first category, I have taken the liberty to select actors whose recorded reflections shed additional light on issues illuminated by Chatfield's observations. The essays on Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement touch upon events that have received extensive scrutiny in recent years. We have chosen not to enter into that vast bibliography. Rather, in my parenthetical comments for this section, I have included only two journalists, Jacques Levy and Peter Matheson, simply because both were physically present at key moments in the history of the movement, and because their published accounts are based on taped interviews and contemporaneous notes. With regard to models that inspired the format of our text and the inclusion of supplementary editorial comments, two classic studies were the most influential. Levy's 1975 Cesar Chavez Autobiography of La Causa, and Stokely Carmichael and Ekweme Michael Thelwell's 2003 Ready for Revolution, The Life and Struggles of Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. By allowing the voices of movement participants to speak for themselves, while an editor provides historical background at key moments, both books construct vibrant narratives that allow entrance into a now distant period of committed social praxis. A genealogy of committed action. LeRoy Chatfield, the primary actor in this book, was an acute observer of the process by which an individual chooses to subordinate her or his desires to a greater good. Very early in his life, he was inserted into collective structures that subordinated personal goals and desires to broader communitarian projects. From the time he became a member of the Christian Brothers at the age of 15, he learned how to negotiate the movement between a life of contemplation and a life of social praxis. He explains this transformation in a short essay titled Brother Misfit, not included here. From August of 1949 until August of 1953, this monastery, Mont La Salle, located on the steep hillside vineyard properties west of Napa, was my home. For the first 2 years, my only contact with the world outside was a monthly visit in the monastery garden picnic area with my family and a 3-week visit home in August. For the last 2.5 years, only a monthly visit on the monastery grounds. Regardless of the section of the monastery to which we were assigned, Christian brothers in training were expected to be in the world, but not of the world. And the reality was that unless one walked the 7-mile mountainous road down to the town, it was a world separate and apart. Eventually leaving the secluded world behind monastery walls, Chatfield, now Brother Gilbert, would venture out into the broader society as a teacher and organizer. Soon after, he would take up his role in the farm worker movement of the mid-1960s. And then, as the revolutionary period of the Vietnam War era subsided and the rise of the conservative Reagan reaction slowly began to roll back many of the victories that had been won, Chatfield devoted himself to the homeless and the disenfranchised, that is, those left behind by the dominant ethos of the emerging neoliberal regime. Greed is good. Richard Ibarra, the longtime personal assistant to Cesar Chavez, recounts a time when a group of international visitors came to Delano. Eager to understand where Chavez fit in the political landscape, one guest pressed him, asking, "How would you describe your political philosophy?" "If I had to label myself," Chavez replied, "I would have to call myself a radical Catholic." In many ways, this term describes the foundation of LeRoy Chatfield's lifelong mission. At its core, the commitment was premised on respecting the dignity of others and working to nurture and sustain that dignity. These were the values that extend across Chatfield's entire career. The importance of a moral vision, the commitment to act upon that vision, and the discipline to not waver from the assigned task are values that appear often here. At the same time, it should surprise no one that having begun his career in a religious order, the dynamics of hierarchy, leaders, and disciples would inform much of the work he would undertake and the approach he adopted to complete it. While it may be true, as Chatfield often says, that he was a true believer in various authority figures, we might also view his dedication as a strong commitment to the vision that the person in charge embodied, or, better yet, as a gift for being able to negotiate the tightrope that leads from the leader's actualization of the vision and back again to the vision itself. Whether we are reading about the first Brother Gilbert, from whom he took his religious name, or the deeply religious pacifist labor organizer Cesar Chavez, or the former Jesuit novice turned politician Jerry Brown, what permeates all of Chatfield's writings is his strong belief that a leaderless movement, a concept experimented with by a few organizations in the 1960s and in vogue today with many young activists, will always lack a key ingredient, perhaps the key ingredient, for successful organizing. The issue of the relationship between leader and movement is one that has vexed many movements and one that cannot be easily resolved. Chatfield's decision to leave the Christian Brothers in 1965 was not a simple one. But rather than being a deviation from his original intention, the shift from Catholic educator to volunteer in an incipient labor movement was a logical continuation. Much has been written about the function of Catholic ritual, especially in its Mexican variations, that marked the culture of the farm worker movement: the Mass, the fast, Nuestra Señora la Virgen de Guadalupe. What the essays that follow reveal is LeRoy Chatfield's central role in the development of that culture. Perhaps no other person was more responsible for coordinating the public acts that transformed Cesar Chavez's religious impulses into tools grounded in Catholic doctrine and history, with the purpose of organizing people across a wide range of varied beliefs. The impact of the first public fast for nonviolence in 1968, for example, would not have been the same without Chatfield's support and meticulous staging of the event. The essays on the farm worker movement allow us to understand many of the most interpreted historical episodes through the eyes and remembrances of someone who had the trust of the man who became the public face of the movement. Because memory is imperfect, surely Chatfield's accounts are open to debate, and yet the integrity for which he was celebrated by so many who knew him provides us near certainty that we are not being intentionally misled due to some personal agenda. On the contrary, Chatfield's writings are thoughtful and self-effacing, like the man who wrote them, and always alert to unavoidable contradictions that inhabited each occurrence. At those moments when he expresses strong opinions, those opinions ought not to be taken as infallible, but rather as the product of the lived experience in a context now many decades in the past. The one constant across the farm worker essays in Part 2 is Chatfield's unwavering dedication to the Mexican, Mexican-American, and Filipino workers with whom he allied himself. His identification is notable at numerous points, but especially in Essay 7, where he refers to himself as a member of the ethnic group with which he had chosen to struggle. In 1963, we were Mexican-American. It wasn't until a few years later that we became Chicanos, and then later still we became Hispanics, and now some of us might be called Latinos. Here, the collective we in struggle gives birth to a no less authentic identity than the one determined by one's birth or ethnicity. A brief scene recounted by journalist Peter Matheson is particularly revealing on this score. Matheson writes, "I had arrived in Delano late in the evening of the last night of July and was to meet Cesar Chavez for the first time the following morning in the office of his assistant, LeRoy Chatfield. The whole staff had just returned from a retreat at St. Anthony's Mission in the Diablo Range. A holy place, Mr. Chatfield said, where we tried to figure out how to make life miserable for rich people." As Chatfield spoke of Chavez and the farm workers, his face was radiant. Mrs. Israel, struck by this, said, "You really love these people, don't you, LeRoy?" Anne Israel, an organizer from the East Coast who had introduced Matheson to Chavez. It was a straight question, not a sentimental one, and it made him blink, but he did not back away from it. "Oh, yes," he said quietly. "I mean, you don't meet people like that." His voice trailed off and he shrugged, at a loss, still smiling. One of the subjects not directly addressed in this book is what the historiography now identifies as the slow decline of the farm worker movement from its peak in the late 1960s to the transformation of the union movement in the late 1970s, the fragmentation of the collective consensus that had attracted hundreds of volunteers over time, and the apparent changes in the leadership style of Chavez himself. When LeRoy and Bonnie Chatfield decided to leave the Union in 1973, all of these changes were still rumbling thunderclaps in the distance, audible but not yet threatening. Chatfield has written, "In August of 1973, I was not prescient enough to know that things were going to get a hell of a lot worse. If my friends and colleagues attributed this reasoning to me, I did not know of it." What happened after has been the primary focus of recent revisionist histories, and in the essays included here, the discerning individual will identify warning signs of what was to come, In any case, for this later period, the Farm Worker Movement Documentation Project is an invaluable resource for hearing the rising chorus of volunteer voices that began to express concern and often dismay about how the movement was drifting into turbulent waters. Many of the works in our suggested readings list also describe the period from the late 1970s until Chavez's passing in 1993. On Leaders and Movements. On the reverse side of the United Farm Workers UFW union membership card designed for supporters in higher education was a quotation from the union's founder. Two items in this quotation are of special interest. First, the idea that organizers, especially those in leadership roles, must make a long-term commitment to the struggle. Chatfield's essays contain numerous variations on the idea that activism, if it is authentic, is never a casual activity. Rather, the activist must commit for an awful long time. The second point raises one of the questions most closely linked to the unraveling of the UFW in the post-1975 period, which is, when is it time for the organizer, founder, leader to step aside so that younger leaders can take up the baton? In the early 20th century, the legendary organizer and intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois noted, "It's the same story with all organizations as it is with some men. After they get to a certain age, they get out of touch with their surroundings, and if they can reorientate themselves, all right, and if they can't, they just die, even though they are living and walking around." This complex issue arises at some point in all organizations, but is especially urgent in grassroots movements for progressive change. How can we remain faithful to our founding values, even as the objective conditions around us are in flux? This was the subject of fierce debate among UFW volunteers both during and after the peak of the farm worker movement. The phrase on the membership card, "until when they get rid of me," reveals Chavez's awareness that for an organization to stay strong, new leaders must emerge. His casual remark to Chatfield as early as 1968 that sooner or later he, Chavez, was going to leave the Union and he had decided that it was going to be sooner, surprises us because it shows that at some level Chavez was always already imagining when and how his departure would take place. And yet Chatfield's belief at the time that the demands of leadership more than likely would never allow for Chavez to walk away turned out to be accurate. A similar dynamic would take shape years later when Chatfield served as director of Loaves and Fishes, an organization devoted to the hungry and the homeless. When to stay, when to leave. A related dilemma for present and future activists to ponder, beyond the eventual substitution of leaders. What if the transformed objective conditions require that the organization itself be displaced? Or, as longtime organizer and scholar Marshall Ganz put it, for most people, social movements are just that, movements. They are transitions, transformations, and they don't last forever, nor should they. The mistake may have been in trying to make it last forever, an abnormality when it comes to social movements. In response to Ganz' comments, Chatfield proposed the following enigma. That is the final and unexplainable paradox, carrying the movement to the human breaking point for most of us, not in leadership, dramatically diminishes the capacity of the movement to live beyond the death or deposition of the founder. But compromising the idealistic principles on which the movement was built to accommodate most of us defeats the goals, the aspirations, and yes, even the vision of the founder. Again, at some level, Cesar Chavez was always well aware of this process. In 1976, in an interview with Tom Hayden, his remarks echoed Du Bois' insight and elaborated on the tension inherent in the movement, organization, dynamic. The other thing that takes place is that the founders of a movement are very idealistic because they had nothing but ideals to begin with. But when the leadership changes hands and the second wave comes in, that really is when the first big decision is made to become less a movement and more an organization. In our movement, as long as the founders are active, we are going to have to try to keep the movement a movement. Once we leave, we'll see one of two things. We'll either become a stronger movement or just a run-of-the-mill organization. Because no individual or leadership group can control the flow of shifting contexts, both micro and macro, from around the time of this 1976 interview forward, the farm worker movement would undergo a slow metamorphosis into a dramatically different entity than it had been less than a decade earlier. Another sobering lesson for organizers that reappears throughout the book. In his introduction to the online group discussion and union veterans that he initiated, Chatfield offered the following reflections. It should come as no surprise that in the development of any organization, a situation arises, a decision is made, and the result becomes a turning point in its history. Unfortunately, the turning point does not become evident until years later, when the time has long since passed to redo or undo what has already been done. Some turning points may contribute greatly, if accidentally, to the successful outcomes of an organization, but there is little motivation to uncover and examine such points because it is generally assumed that the successes realized were the inevitable product of wise decision-making. There is little reason to question success, even if, truth be told, it was accidental or lucky. But when a successful organization unexpectedly tacks off in a different direction or begins to stall or experiences a downturn in its fortunes, surely a turning point must have occurred. What happened to cause this change? Why did it occur, and when? What is to be gained by uncovering such a turning point? Even if it can be identified with some certainty, there is nothing to be done about it. The organization cannot rewind, erase, and redo this series of events. It was their good fortune, perhaps, that drew Bonnie and LeRoy away from their beloved union before it tacked off course and lost its direction. What followed for them were two periods of their shared pilgrimage, extending across many years that are replete with commitments premised upon the core beliefs at work in earlier moments. Confirmed 4 times by the California State Senate during the first administration of Governor Jerry Brown, Chatfield was named to the newly formed Agricultural Labor Relations Board, ALRB, in 1975. The board was poised to make major improvements to the existing conditions for farm workers. It did not take long before emissaries from the Teamsters Union arrived at the ALRB office in Sacramento to rough up both Chatfield and the board chairman, Bishop Roger Mahoney, telling them they should resign or bad things might happen to them. Both men received 24-hour police protection for several days. A less dramatic appointment followed when Brown named Chatfield as director of the newly created California Conservation Corps, CCC. Inaugurated by Brown in 1976, the mission of the CCC was to further the development and maintenance of the natural resources and environment of the state, and to provide the young men and women of the state meaningful, productive employment. Shortly after taking the reins of the CCC in 1977, Chatfield developed the organizational guidelines and established 18 new field centers during his brief 2-year tenure. Upon leaving state government, Chatfield, in effect, returned to his core intention of serving the poor and the unprotected from the grassroots level. Now his commitment would be transferred to the homeless population, a demographic that had expanded dramatically during the 2-term presidency of Ronald Reagan, grew back under the rollback of social services during the Clinton era, and exploded by the end of the Obama administration. The transformation of the U.S. economy to favor the wealthy and the attendant tearing apart of the social safety net meant that hunger and homelessness would increase in the richest nation in the world. Like the writings generated by his earlier commitments, Part 3 spans his time with the organization Loaves and Fishes and contains multiple lessons about how to organize disempowered communities. First, the logistics of providing the basic necessities for those who lack them. Second,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?